You're not allowed to say the word dead in ancient Rome. Not out loud, not near a dying man, because the Romans believed a soul could hear you say it and refused to leave the body. This is how an entire civilization built rituals, professions, and even blood sport around one single problem. What do you do with a corpse? The second a Roman stopped breathing, someone leaned in and called their name. 3 times, loudly. This was called the conclamatio. Not grief, a test. If nobody answered after the third call, you were officially dead. Then someone closed your eyes. A coin was placed under your tongue, payment for Charon, the ferryman who rows souls across the river Styx. No coin, no ferry. Your spirit wanders the riverbank forever. Romans took this seriously enough that archaeologists still find skeletons with coins wedged behind the teeth 2,000 years later. Once you died, your house changed overnight. A branch of cypress or pine was hung on the door. It meant one thing to every passerby: stay away, this house is polluted. Because that's what death was to the Romans. Not just sad, contaminating. The family was now in luctu, in mourning, spiritually unclean, barred from temples, barred from public sacrifice, sometimes barred from even bathing properly. Death didn't just take the person, it infected the household. The undertakers. Nobody wanted to be. Here's where it gets strange. Rome had professional undertakers, called libertinari, named after Libitina, the goddess of funerals. Their headquarters was a temple to that goddess, and every single death in the city had to be registered there. It was, essentially, Rome's death office, a running body count of the empire's capital. But the undertakers themselves were treated like outcasts. In Roman society, touching a corpse for money made you almost untouchable. They lived on the edges of the city. They weren't allowed to hold certain public roles. Death was necessary. The people who handled it were shunned for it. If you were rich, your funeral wasn't quiet. It was theatre. Professional mourners called praefici were hired. Women paid specifically to wail, scream, tear their hair, and claw at their own faces in public grief. The louder, the better. Some families hired entire troops of them. Then came the masks. Wealthy Roman families kept wax death masks of their ancestors, called imagines maiorum, stored in the front hall of the house like trophies. At a funeral, actors would put these masks on and walk in the procession, literally impersonating the dead relatives of generations past. Your great-great-grandfather would show up to your funeral, wearing his own face. Imagine burying someone today and having actors in your dead relatives' faces walk behind the casket. Rome did this for centuries and considered it completely normal. Here's the part that breaks people's brains. Gladiator fights didn't start as entertainment, they started as funerals. The earliest recorded gladiator match in Rome was staged in 264 BC at the funeral of a nobleman named Junius Brutus Pera. His sons had 3 pairs of slaves fight to the death at his tomb. The idea was that spilled blood honored the dead and helped the soul on its journey. It caught on. By the late Republic, staging bloodier and bigger gladiator games at your father's funeral became a status symbol. Julius Caesar once put on a funeral games with over 300 gladiator pairs. What we remember today as the Colosseum's blood sport began as an act of mourning. For most of Roman history, cremation was the default. Bodies were burned on funeral pyres and the ashes stored in urns, sometimes in massive communal buildings called columbaria, literally dovecotes, walls lined with small square niches like a filing cabinet for the dead. Some columbaria held the ashes of hundreds of people, rich and poor, slave and free, stacked side by side in death the way they never were in life. Then, starting around the 2nd century AD, something shifted. Inhumation, burial of the whole body, started replacing cremation. Nobody fully agrees why. Some historians point to the spread of mystery religions promising bodily resurrection. Some point to Eastern influence moving west along trade routes. Whatever the cause, within a couple hundred years, burial had almost completely replaced burning across the empire. Not everyone could afford a funeral with actors and hired mourners. So ordinary Romans, tradesmen, freedmen, even slaves, joined burial clubs called collegia funeraticia. Members paid small monthly dues into a shared fund. When you died, the club covered your funeral and guaranteed you a proper burial instead of being dumped in a mass pit outside the city walls. That fear, being thrown into an unmarked pit with no rites, was a real and common terror in Rome. It wasn't just about dying, it was about dying with nobody to remember you. Romans didn't think death ended the relationship. Every February, families gathered for a festival called Parentalia, 9 straight days of visiting family graves, leaving food, wine, and flowers for dead relatives. It closed with a public feast called Feralia. Then, in May, came Lemuria, a festival specifically for placating restless or angry ghosts, where the head of the household walked barefoot through the house at midnight, throwing black beans over his shoulder, repeating a chant 9 times to drive wandering spirits out. You didn't just bury your dead. You kept feeding them, kept negotiating with them. The line between the living and the dead in Rome was thin, and both sides were expected to keep showing up. Roman tombstones lined every road leading into a city because burial inside city walls was banned. Travelers walked past thousands of epitaphs on their way in and out. Some are grand, most aren't. One of the most common phrases carved into ordinary Roman gravestones reads, in Latin shorthand, non fui, non sum, non curo. I was not, I was, I am not, I don't care, not a prayer, not a promise of heaven. Just a flat, almost shrugging acknowledgement, you didn't exist. Then you did. Now you don't again. And that's fine. Strip away the coins under the tongue, the wax masks, the hired screamers, and the gladiators bleeding out at a tomb, and you're left with something oddly familiar. A civilization that built an entire architecture of ritual, expense, and spectacle around the same problem every human society has ever faced. How do you let someone go and still keep them close? The Romans didn't fear death quietly. They argued with it, negotiated with it, threw parties for it, and staged fights in its honor. And in the end, they carved 4 short lines into stone and left it at the side of the road for strangers to read forever. I was not. I was. I am not. I don't care. Maybe that's not indifference. Maybe that's the closest anyone's ever gotten to peace with it.